Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There exists, in the northwestern corner of Middle-earth, a land so quiet that even the wind seems to tread softly upon its fields. Rolling hills crowned with round doors painted in cheerful colors, green, blue, yellow, rise and fall like the gentle breathing of the earth itself. Gardens burst with vegetables no army has ever trampled. Potatoes fat and golden, cabbages wrapped in layers of emerald leaves, tomatoes ripening on vines that have never known fire. Lanterns glow like fallen stars in windows of homes that have never known siege, their warm light spilling across doorsteps worn smooth by generations of unhurried feet. The Shire, a place of laughter, pipeweed, and second breakfasts, of afternoon naps and evening songs, rests beneath an open sky, unfortified, unguarded, and utterly defenseless. And yet, throughout the long darkness of the Third Age, when the shadow in the east grew terrible and vast, when armies of orcs swept across Gondor's outer provinces, and the Nazgul rode forth on wings of terror that blotted out the stars, the Shire remained untouched. Not a single column of Mordor's legions ever marched upon Hobbiton. Not one tower of Barad-dûr's design ever rose above the water. No orc standard was ever planted in the fields of the East Farthing. No flames consumed the market stalls of Mitchell Delving. The Dark Lord, who commanded tens of thousands, who shattered kingdoms and bent the wills of kings, who reduced cities to rubble and turned fertile lands into ash, never once turned his gaze, truly turned it, upon this gentle green land. Why? It is a question whispered in the halls of Rivendell, debated in the libraries of Minas Tirith, and pondered by those who study the movements of power and the hidden currents of history. Scholars have spent lifetimes examining the strategic decisions of the Third Age, tracing the movements of armies, analyzing the deployments of forces. And always they return to this puzzle. How did a land so vulnerable, so soft, so completely without defense survive the age of Sauron's dominion? Was it luck, geography, divine providence, or something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of fate itself? The answer, as with all great mysteries of the legendarium, is not simple. It is layered like the roots of the party tree, reaching down into soil both ancient and strange, drawing nourishment from sources both seen and unseen. To understand why Sauron never invaded the Shire, we must walk the borders of forgotten kingdoms, listen to the whispers of hidden guardians, and peer into the mind of the Dark Lord himself, a mind vast, brilliant, proud, and fatally blind. So let us begin. Let us step into twilight fields where the first stars are kindling, where smoke curls from chimneys and the smell of bread drifts on evening air, where children play their last games before being called in for supper. Let us ask the question that even the wise struggled to answer, the riddle that confounded generals and troubled the dreams of strategists. What protected the Shire when nothing else could? The stage is set. The lanterns are lit. The evening star rises above Bag End, bright and steady. And in the distance, on a far mountain peak shrouded in perpetual shadow, something stirs, watching, waiting, calculating, but never crossing the border. Not yet. To understand the survival of the Shire, we must first understand its place within the grand and perilous map of Middle-earth. This is no small task. The world Tolkien crafted is vast beyond measure, scarred by wars that span millennia, and haunted by the ruins of elder days when gods walked the earth and stars were young. Kingdoms rise and fall like tides governed by celestial forces. Forests grow dark with ancient malice or glow with timeless grace. Mountains split under the weight of curses spoken in tongues no living being remembers. And in the midst of it all, tucked away in a northwestern corner that most maps barely acknowledge, lies the Shire, a patch of green so small it seems almost an afterthought, a footnote in the grand narrative of empires and wars. But placement, as any scholar of war will tell you, is everything. Location determines survival. Geography shapes destiny. The Shire sits in Eriador, the great western lands that were once the beating heart of the kingdom of Arnor. Long before hobbits ever planted their first garden, long before the first round door was painted or the first hole dug into a hillside, this region was ruled by the Dunedain, the descendants of Númenor, tall and mighty, and wise beyond the measure of ordinary men. Their cities gleamed under the sun like jewels set in green velvet. Their towers watched over every road, every pass, every crossing of every river. Their kings bore the blood of Elros himself, brother to Elrond half-elven, and their realms stretched from the gray havens in the west to the misty mountains in the east, from the northern ice fields to the southern borders where Gondor's influence began. Arnor was a power to be reckoned with. Its armies were disciplined and skilled. Its people were learned, preserving lore from Númenor and from even older days. Its fortresses were strong, built to endure ages. For a time, the north was as mighty as the south, and the kingdoms of the Dunedain stood as twin pillars supporting the free peoples against the darkness. But Arnor fell. Slowly, bitterly, across centuries of division, civil war, and relentless assault. The kingdom fractured into 3 jealous fragments: Arthedain, Cardolan, Rudor, each ruled by descendants of the original royal line, each claiming legitimacy, each weakened by division. And those fragments were ground to dust by the Witch King of Angmar, the greatest and most terrible of the Nazgul, who established a realm of evil in the north for the sole purpose of destroying the Dunedain. The wars were long and brutal. Cities burned. Populations fled or were slaughtered. The last king of Arthedain died in battle, and with him died the kingdom. By the time the hobbits arrived, wandering west from the Vale of Anduin in search of quieter lands, Eriador was a haunted ruin. The cities were empty shells, their walls crumbling, their streets reclaimed by grass and wildflowers. The towers were broken stumps, home now only to birds and wind. The roads were overgrown, barely visible beneath layers of moss and soil. It was a land of ghosts, of memories, of silence. And yet the bones of that old kingdom remained. The Shire, though it seemed wild and unclaimed when the hobbits first settled it, was built atop layers of older authority, older power. The North Downs rose to the north, their ridges still showing the remnants of fortresses and watchtowers, their stones worn but unbroken. The Barrow Downs stretched to the south, where kings of old slept beneath grassy mounds, their tombs filled with treasure and terror, their spirits restless and dangerous. To the east loomed the misty mountains, a natural barrier few armies could cross without terrible loss. And to the west lay the gray havens and the sea, lands of the elves, where Círdan the shipwright still kept watch, ancient and patient. In short, the Shire was surrounded, not by enemies but by echoes. Echoes of power, echoes of vigilance, echoes of kingdoms that had once stood guard over these very fields, that had shed blood to keep the darkness at bay. And then there were the Dunedain themselves. Though Arnor had fallen, though its cities were ruins and its throne was empty, its heirs did not vanish. They became rangers, wanderers clad in weathered cloaks the color of stone and shadow, carrying swords passed down through generations, swords forged in the elder days with skill no living smith could match. They spoke Sindarin in the firelight, sang songs of Numenor in quiet voices, and walked paths no cartographer could map. These men, uncrowned and unrecognized, patrolled the wilderness of Eriador with a dedication that bordered on the sacred. They hunted orcs in the hills, tracking them through forest and fen. They tracked wargs through the forests, driving them back before they could descend on villages. They stood between the remnants of civilization and the creeping dark, a thin line of steel and determination. And they watched over the Shire. Most hobbits never knew they existed. To the folk of Hobbiton and Bywater, to the farmers of the East Farthing and the merchants of Mitchell Delving, rangers were figures of rumor, strange, grim-faced men occasionally glimpsed on the borders, rough and dangerous-looking, best avoided. The hobbits did not realize that these men were their unseen shield. That every quiet night, every harvest safely gathered, every child who played without fear in the meadows, all of it was made possible by the vigilance of the rangers. So when we ask why Sauron never invaded the Shire, part of the answer lies here, because the Shire was never truly alone. It rested within a web of ancient protections, some visible, most not. It was buffered by geography, rivers, forests, hills, mountains. It was veiled by obscurity, a land so unremarkable that it did not appear on the maps of the mighty. And it was silently guarded by the last descendants of kings, men who had sworn oaths in the darkness and kept them through long, thankless years. But that is only part of the answer. For there is another force at work here, one far more subtle and far more dangerous to the Dark Lord than any blade or wall, his own arrogance. A lone ranger steps from the shadow of a willow tree, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. His hand rests on the hilt of a blade older than the Shire itself, a weapon that has tasted the blood of orcs and worse things. He looks east, toward the misty mountains, where the sky darkens even in daylight and his jaw tightens. He does not speak. He does not need to. Somewhere far beyond those mountains, far beyond the lands he patrols, something is waking. Something vast and terrible and patient. And he knows, with the certainty of blood and duty and generations of accumulated sorrow, that the days of peace are numbered. Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor, the Lieutenant of Morgoth, the Deceiver, the enemy. He was many things. A mire of the people of Alle, gifted with great cunning and skill in craft. A servant of the first Dark Lord, who learned from his master the arts of domination and corruption. A smith of terrible power, who forged the one ring in the fires of Mount Doom. A deceiver who walked among kings in fair form, calling himself Anator, the Lord of Gifts, twisting their hearts with promises of glory. But above all else, above even his malice and his hunger for control, Sauron was proud. And pride, as the old tales remind us again and again, as the Ainulindalë teaches and history confirms, is the seed of ruin. To Sauron, the world was a game of thrones and towers, of domination and subjugation. Power was measured in armies, in fortresses, in the bending of nations beneath his will. He thought in terms of conquest, of Gondor's white city with its 7 levels and its tower of guard, Rohan's cavalry sweeping across the plains like a golden tide, the elven strongholds of Rivendell hidden in its valley, and Lothlorien wrapped in its golden trees. These were the pieces that mattered on the board of Middle-earth. These were the threats he needed to crush, the prizes he needed to claim, the powers he needed to break. The Shire. It did not even appear on his board. Think of it from his perspective, from the vantage point of Barad-dûr, where he sits in his dark throne, surveying the world through instruments of power and networks of spies. Here is a land with no walls, no fortifications beyond a few hedges and fences meant to keep livestock in place. No soldiers, no standing army, not even a militia. No king, no lord, no central authority. Just a Tyne whose position is largely ceremonial, a mayor whose main duty is presiding over banquets. A land whose people stand barely 3 feet tall, whose greatest concerns are the ripeness of tomatoes, the quality of the season's pipeweed crop, and the scheduling of festivals. They have no history of war, no martial tradition whatsoever. No legends of heroes slaying dragons or conquering enemies. No artifacts of power, no ancient swords, no rings, no crowns blessed by the valor. They are farmers, gardeners, brewers, pipe smokers. In the grand narrative of Middle-earth struggles, in the chess game of domination that Sauron plays, they are background characters, pleasant, perhaps, but utterly irrelevant. And so Sauron did what all tyrants do when confronted with the small and the humble, what all great powers do when they encounter those who seem to pose no threat. He dismissed them. He looked past the Shire as one might look past a mouse in a field while hunting wolves. His spies reported on Gondor's strength, on the movements of its armies and the state of its defenses. They brought news of Rohan's alliances, of the bond between Theoden and Denethor. They whispered of Saruman's activities in Isengard, of the wizard's growing ambition and his mysterious experiments. But the Shire was beneath notice, beneath consideration, beneath the threshold of what Sauron considered worthy of his attention. This is not mere speculation or wishful interpretation. We see evidence of Sauron's blindness, of his fundamental inability to understand the hobbits throughout the War of the Ring. When Gollum is captured by Aragorn and the Rangers, when he is brought to the dungeons of Barad-dûr and interrogated by the Dark Lord's most skilled torturers, he speaks of Shire and Baggins, babbling and hissing the words in his wretched voice. But even then, even with the names spoken aloud in his very fortress, Sauron does not fully grasp the significance. He knows a halfling has the ring. This much filters through his malice, this much he understands. But he cannot conceive that such a creature could pose a threat. He cannot imagine that a hobbit might resist the ring's power. He assumes the ring will be used, wielded as a weapon, claimed by someone mighty, Aragorn, perhaps, the heir of Isildur, or Gandalf, the wizard who has opposed him for so long. The idea that a hobbit might seek to destroy the ring, rather than wield it, that notion is so foreign to Sauron's nature that it might as well be written in a language he cannot read. Power to Sauron exists to be used. The strong dominate the weak. This is the fundamental law of his universe. Ambition drives all action. The will to power is universal. The notion of self-sacrifice, of renunciation, of a small person choosing annihilation over dominion, of deliberately throwing away the greatest weapon ever forged. These are concepts so alien to him, so utterly outside his frame of reference that they are literally unthinkable. And therein lies the great irony, the cosmic joke at the heart of his downfall. Sauron's strength, his intelligence, his vision, his mastery of strategy, his ability to plan across centuries becomes his fatal flaw. He is so attuned to the movements of the mighty, so focused on tracking kings and wizards and armies, that he is blind to the quiet steps of the meek. He watches the horizon for banners and misses the lone traveler on the road. He counts battalions and overlooks the gardener with a pack on his back. History, both in Middle-earth and beyond its borders, is filled with such mistakes. The great empires that ignore the border tribes, assuming they are too primitive to matter, only to be overwhelmed by them. The generals who overlook the undefended pass, thinking it too difficult to traverse, only to have their supply lines cut. The kings who dismiss the whispered rebellion in the countryside, thinking peasants cannot possibly threaten the throne, only to face revolution. Sauron, for all his power, for all his accumulated wisdom across thousands of years, is no different. He is a tyrant, and tyrants see the world only in terms of their own reflection, measuring everything by their own values. But while Sauron's gaze is fixed on Minas Tirith, while his armies gather in Mordor and his Nazgûl scour the land for rumors of the ring, while he calculates angles of assault and plots the downfall of kingdoms, something slips through his fingers. A report, a fragment, a whispered name echoing through the dungeons of Barad-dûr. Baggins. It is faint, almost nothing. A sound lost among thousands of other reports, other names, other fragments of intelligence. But in the depths of Barad-dûr, where the eye burns without rest, where the Dark Lord sits in sleepless vigilance, a flicker of attention turns northward. Not toward kingdoms or strongholds, not toward the places of power, but toward a place of green hills and round doors, toward a land he has never bothered to consider. For the first time in long ages, the shadow begins to wonder, what if the small are not as powerless as they seem? What if I have overlooked something? But even this thought is fleeting, drowned in the torrent of other concerns, other strategies, other wars to wage. And so the opportunity passes. The moment slips by, and the Shire, unknowing, turns through another season. They are called the Rangers of the North, though few know them by that name, and fewer still understand what they truly are. To the innkeepers of Bree, they are rough, dangerous men, wanderers who pay in strange coin, tarnished silver pieces bearing the marks of kings long dead, and speak little, preferring shadows to hearth light. To the farmers on the borders of the Shire, they are shadows glimpsed at dusk, figures standing on hilltops in the rain, watching, always watching, vanishing when approached. To the hobbits themselves, they are almost myth, stories told to children about the wild folk who roam beyond the borders, warnings to stay close to home when darkness falls. But the Rangers are no myth. They are flesh and blood and bone, as real as the swords they carry and the trails they walk. They are the last living remnants of the kingdom of Arnor, the blood of Númenor flowing still in their veins, despite the long ages and the mingling of peoples. They are the descendants of kings, though they wear no crowns and claim no thrones. They carry swords forged in the elder days, blades with names and histories, weapons that have drunk the blood of servants of the enemy since before the sun first rose. They speak the tongue of the elves, Sindarin flowing from their lips as naturally as the common speech, for they were raised on tales of Elendil and Elrose, of the glory that was and the hope that might yet be, and they watch over the Shire. This duty is ancient, passed down through generations like a precious heirloom, a quiet oath taken in firelight and shadow, renewed in the heart of every ranger who comes of age. When Argileb II, king of Arthedain, granted the hobbits permission to settle in the Shire over 1,000 years before the War of the Ring, in the year 1601 of the Third Age by the reckoning of the Shire, the Dunedain accepted a silent charge to guard this land, to keep it safe, to ensure that the small folk within could live their lives in peace, untroubled by the darkness that crept ever closer from the east. Most hobbits never knew. How could they? They saw no soldiers at their gates, no banners flying over their fields, no patrols marching through their streets. They paid no taxes to support an army. They received no proclamations from protectors. They believed themselves safe by virtue of isolation, by the simple luck of being too far from anywhere important, by the fact that no one cared enough to bother them. They did not realize that every night, while they slept in their cozy beds beneath their grassy hills, men stood watch in the dark places beyond their borders. That orc bands creeping down from the mountains were turned back before they could reach the East Farthing, met with arrows in the night and cold steel at dawn. That wolves gathering in the forests were hunted down before they could descend on the farms, their bodies left to rot as warnings to others. That ancient evils stirring in the Barrow Downs, wights and worse things that crawled from their tombs seeking warm flesh, were met with fire and blessed blade. The rangers moved like ghosts through the wilderness. They left no trace of their passing. When dawn broke over the fields and hobbit children ran laughing through the gardens, splashing in streams and climbing trees, they had no idea that blood had been spilled in the night to keep them safe. No idea that grim-faced men had stood between them and horrors they could not imagine, had fought battles they would never hear of, had paid prices they would never know. It was thankless work, exhausting, dangerous beyond measure. The rangers lived hard lives, sleeping under stars more often than roofs, eating what they could hunt or forage, mending their own wounds with needle and thread because there was no one else to do it. They grew weathered and grim before their time. Their faces became maps of old battles, scarred and lined. Their eyes carried the weight of things seen and not spoken of, horrors witnessed in the dark that would break lesser men. And yet they did not falter. They did not abandon their duty or seek easier paths, because they remembered. They remembered the glory of Arnor, the kingdoms of their fathers that had stood tall and proud. They remembered the oaths sworn in ages past, the promises made by their ancestors to defend the innocent and oppose the darkness. They remembered that once, their people had been protectors, shepherds of civilization, and that duty does not end simply because the crown is lost or the kingdom has fallen. Among them walked Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain, though in those days he was known by other names, Strider, to the suspicious folk of Bree who saw him as just another rough ranger. Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, to the men of Gondor and Rohan whom he had served in disguise. Estel, Hope, to the elves of Rivendell who had raised him in secret. He was perhaps the greatest of the rangers, and he knew the Shire better than most of his people. He had walked its borders countless times over the decades of his long life. He had stood in the rain on the edge of the old forest, watching the lanterns of Hobbiton glow warm against the gathering dark, small points of light defiant against the night. He had seen hobbit children play in complete innocence, utterly unaware of the world's danger, utterly untouched by the shadow, and he had smiled, bitterly perhaps knowing what he knew and what they did not, but smiled nonetheless. Because that was what they were protecting, not just land, not just fields and gardens and cozy holes, but innocence itself. The possibility that somewhere in some corner of the world, life could be simple, safe, unburdened by the weight of history and the terror of what lurked in the darkness. The Shire could not defend itself. It had no army, no fortifications, no warriors trained in the arts of war, but it did not need them. It had the rangers, And the rangers, though unseen and unthanked, though their deeds went unrecorded in any hobbit's tale, were enough. At least for a time. One cold autumn night, when the first frost touches the grass and the stars burn bright and hard in a clear sky, a ranger crouches on a hilltop overlooking the Brandywine River. The wind is sharp, carrying the scent of rain from the east and something else, something that makes the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He listens, every sense alert. And then he hears it, a sound that does not belong to this land, a sound that chills his blood. A horn, distant and deep, blown from somewhere far to the east beyond the mountains. It is not the horn of Gondor with its clear, proud note. It is not the call of Rohan, fierce and free. It is something older, something colder, something that speaks of malice and ancient hatred. He rises slowly, hand on his sword, and looks toward the mountains. His breath mists in the cold air. He knows, without needing to be told, without any messenger bringing word, that the watch is no longer enough, that the old defenses are failing. Something is coming, something vast and terrible. And this time, even the rangers may not be able to hold it back. He turns toward the Shire, toward the lights twinkling in the distance, and whispers a prayer in Sindarin, a blessing for the innocent. And then he disappears into the night, moving to warn his brothers. There is a kind of magic in the Shire that even the wise do not fully understand, a subtle enchantment woven into the very fabric of the land. It is not the magic of spells or rings or ancient words of power spoken in high tongues. It is not the sorcery of Sauron or the craft of the elves. It is something quieter, deeper, a grace woven into the very soil, the air, the water, the simple rhythms of life that pulse through the land like a gentle heartbeat. The hobbits themselves do not possess it, not in the way a wizard does, wielding staff and speaking words that reshape reality, or an elf whose very existence is touched by the light of Valinor. They cannot speak words that shake mountains or kindle fire from nothing. They have no rings of power, no ancient artifacts, but they are touched by something nonetheless, something that sets them apart. Perhaps it is the lingering influence of the Valar, the powers of the world, who shaped Middle-earth in the beginning and set within it seeds of goodness that even Morgoth in all his malice could not wholly destroy. Perhaps it is the result of Gandalf's long friendship with the Shire, his countless visits over the centuries, his quiet blessings murmured over pipeweed and seed cakes, his genuine love for the hobbits and their simple joys. Perhaps it is simply that hobbits, by their very nature, by the curious quirks of their being, resist corruption in ways that men and elves and even dwarves do not. Consider the One Ring, the masterwork of Sauron's craft. Forged in the fires of Mount Doom, imbued with a vast portion of his own power, designed specifically to dominate all life, to bend wills and break spirits, to corrupt absolutely. It is the most corrupting force in all of Middle-earth. Kings fall to its whispers, their minds twisted until they see enemies everywhere and trust no one. Wizards are tempted by its promise of the power to do good, to set the world right, only to become tyrants worse than Sauron. Even the mightiest, the purest, feel its pull. Galadriel, ancient and powerful beyond mortal understanding, knows that she would become a dark queen if she claimed it. Gandalf refuses even to touch it, knowing his desire to use it for good would be his downfall. And yet, a hobbit carried it for 60 years and remained whole. Bilbo Baggins, who found the ring in the dark beneath the misty mountains, who picked it up thinking it nothing more than a bit of luck, a curious trinket, he lived with it in Bag End for decades. 60 years. He felt its pull, yes. He felt its weight growing over time, the way it whispered to him, the way it made him feel thin, stretched like butter scraped over too much bread. But he did not become a wraith. He did not descend into the madness that claimed Gollum. He did not murder for it or scheme to keep it. He threw parties. He wrote poetry. He translated elvish lore and composed memoirs of his adventures. He went on walks and smoked his pipe and complained about his relatives. And when the time came, though it pained him more than anything in his long life, though it felt like tearing out a piece of his own heart, he was able to let it go. No man could have done that. No elf, no dwarf, perhaps no other being in all of Middle-earth. Only a hobbit. Why? Because hobbits do not crave power in the way other races do. They do not dream of thrones or dominion or bending others to their will. Their desires are small, immediate, and rooted in the earth. Good food lovingly prepared, warm fires on cold nights, the company of friends and the comfort of familiar places. Ambition, in the way Sauron understands it, in the way it drives the affairs of kingdoms and the hearts of the mighty, is almost foreign to them. They are content. And contentment, strange as it may sound, is a kind of armor that the ring cannot easily pierce. Gandalf understood this. He saw in the hobbits a strength that others overlooked, a resilience born not of might but of humility. When he chose Bilbo for the quest to Erebor, the dwarves scoffed and complained, seeing only a small, soft creature with no experience of the world. When he entrusted the ring to Frodo, even the wise questioned his judgment, wondering how such a burden could be placed on such small shoulders. But Gandalf knew. He knew that the small, the humble, the unambitious, these were the ones who could endure what the mighty could not. These were the ones who might, just might, succeed where heroes would fail. And so the Shire, for all its lack of walls and weapons, for all its apparent defenselessness, was protected by something Sauron could never breach. The simple, stubborn resilience of its people, their ability to resist the very corruption that was his greatest weapon. There is also the matter of the elves, whose influence in the world is fading but not yet gone. Though they no longer dwell in Eriador as they once did, when kingdoms of the Noldor stretched across the land, their presence lingers like the scent of flowers after rain. The gray havens lie to the west, and from there, Círdan the shipwright watches the coastlands, ancient beyond reckoning, building ships for the journey to Valinor. Elrond dwells in Rivendell, and his house is a sanctuary of lore and power, a place where the darkness cannot easily come. Galadriel, though far to the south in Lothlorien, knows the movements of the world, reads the whispers of the wind and the patterns of the stars. The elves do not march to war for the Shire. It is not their charge, not their duty. But their presence, distant and subtle as it may be, creates a web of awareness, a network of watching and knowing. Evil does not move unchallenged in the West, not while the elves remain. And then there is the memory of the Valar themselves, the powers who shaped the world before the sun and moon were made. Eriador, in the elder days, was touched by the light of Valinor, blessed by the presence of the elves who had seen the two trees and walked in the gardens of the blessed realm. The Númenóreans who settled here were themselves blessed by the Valar before their fall, granted long life and wisdom as rewards for their faithfulness. That blessing, though faint now, distant, like the echo of a song heard long ago, has not entirely faded. The land itself remembers. And memory, in Tolkien's world, in the deep mythology of the legendarium, is a form of power. So the Shire is not merely a piece of farmland, not just fields and gardens tended by simple folk. It is a repository of grace, a place where the ancient good of the world has not yet been extinguished, where the light still lingers even if most cannot see it. And that grace, invisible though it may be, creates a barrier, not a wall of stone or steel, but something more fundamental. Something that Sauron, for all his might, cannot easily cross, not because he lacks the strength, but because he lacks the understanding. Because grace and humility and contentment are concepts so foreign to his nature that he cannot perceive them, cannot account for them in his strategies. But now, in the darkness of Mordor, where the fires never cease and the air is thick with ash and malice, something stirs. The Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the 9 who once were kings of men and now are slaves bound utterly to the Dark Lord's will, are summoned to the throne room of Barad-dûr. They stand before the eye, wraith forms barely holding to the shapes of men, and receive their orders. "Shire!" Baggins. The words are simple. The command is clear. Find the halfling, retrieve the ring. They do not understand why this matters. They do not question. They have no will of their own to question with. They mount their fell steeds, creatures of shadow and terror, wrap themselves in cloaks that seem to absorb light itself, and ride forth into the west. And for the first time in long centuries, the Shire is not safe. The grace that has protected it is about to be tested as never before. It should never have happened. By all the laws of probability, by all the careful calculations of fate and chance, by every reasonable expectation of how the world works, the One Ring should never have come to rest in the Shire. Think about it. The ring was forged in Mount Doom, in the very heart of Mordor, crafted by Sauron himself in the fires of Orodruin with a vast portion of his own power poured into the metal. It was meant to be the instrument of ultimate dominion, designed to control the other rings of power, and through them to enslave elves, dwarves, and men. It was meant to be worn by kings, wielded by conquerors, a tool of empire and terror that would reduce the free peoples to servitude. Instead, it ended up in a wooden drawer in Bag End, tucked beside handkerchiefs and pipe cleaners and a curious collection of buttons, in a house owned by a hobbit who used it primarily to avoid unwanted visitors. The cosmic irony is staggering. The absurdity of it would be comical if the stakes were not so terrifyingly high. For over 2,000 years after Isildur's death, the ring was lost, lying in the mud at the bottom of the Anduin River, covered by silt and forgotten by the world. But it was not inert. It had a will of its own, or perhaps it was more accurate to say it was an extension of Sauron's will, acting even when its master was diminished and powerless. It wanted to be found. It called out, in ways subtle and strange, seeking a bearer who would return it to Mordor, who would bring it back to the hand that forged it. And in time, it found one. Daegal, a store hobbit fishing with his cousin Smeagol, who was dragged into the water when his boat capsized and found the ring lying in the riverbed, gleaming gold. But Smeagol murdered Daegal for it within minutes, strangled his own cousin and took the ring for himself, and the transformation began. Smeagol became Gollum, a creature twisted by the ring's influence, who clutched it in the dark for nearly 500 years. But even that was not enough to return the ring to Sauron. Gollum hid. He stayed beneath the misty mountains, in the deepest tunnels where light never came, away from the world and its movements. And the ring, though it possessed him utterly, though it destroyed everything that was once good in him, remained hidden with him, unable to complete its journey home, until Bilbo stumbled upon it. A hobbit. A gentle hobbit of the Shire, a burglar on an adventure he barely understood, hired by dwarves to help reclaim their mountain kingdom, fleeing from goblins in tunnels beneath stone. He picked up the ring in the dark, thought it a trifle, a bit of luck, something that might prove useful, and pocketed it without a second thought. And so the weapon forged to enslave the world, the masterwork of the Dark Lord's malice, ended up in the Shire. Sauron, slowly returning to power in Mordor, gathering his strength in Dol Guldur, and then openly reclaiming his throne in Barad-dûr, searching desperately for his lost treasure with every resource at his command, never imagined this. How could he? The Shire was not on his map, not in his calculations. Hobbits were not players in the great game of power. The idea that his ring, his precious, his masterwork, the key to all his designs, might be sitting in a hole in the ground in a backwater region of the Northwest, owned by a creature who used it to play tricks on his neighbors, was laughable, absurd, beyond consideration. And yet, that is exactly what happened. For decades, the ring rested in Bag End. 60 years. Bilbo aged more slowly than he should have, his life extended by the ring's power. He felt its pull, its weight growing over time, the way it whispered to him in moments of stress or anger. But he resisted. He lived a relatively normal life, eccentric perhaps, known for his oddities and his wealth and his grand parties, but not monstrous. He threw the party of the century for his 111st birthday. He adopted a nephew, Frodo, and made him his heir. He translated Elvish poetry and wrote memoirs of his adventures with the dwarves. He went on long walks and smoked his pipe and argued with the Sackville Bagginses. All the while, the Dark Lord's greatest weapon lay within arm's reach, and Sauron had no idea. It is tempting to imagine an alternate history, to play the game of, what if that historians and scholars love? What if Sauron had learned of the ring's location earlier? What if his spies had been more thorough, his network of informants more comprehensive, his Nazgul more perceptive? What if, in the year 3001 of the Third Age, when Bilbo celebrated his 111st birthday and vanished in front of the assembled guests of the Shire, the forces of Mordor had descended upon Hobbiton? The devastation would have been total, absolute. The hobbits had no defense, no way to resist. No army could have stopped the Nazgul if they came in force. The Rangers would have fought, certainly, would have given their lives to protect the Shire, but 9 ringwraiths supported by orc legions would have been too much. The Shire would have burned. Every home, every field, every garden would have been trampled and scorched. The hobbits would have been scattered or enslaved or slaughtered. And the ring, unguarded and ripe for the taking, would have been returned to its master. The war would have ended before it began. Gondor, already weakened, would have fallen within years. Rohan would have been crushed. The elves, diminished and preparing to leave Middle-earth, would have been hunted down. The free peoples would have been enslaved or destroyed. Darkness would have covered the world, unbroken and absolute, for ages uncounted. But it did not happen, because Sauron, in his arrogance, did not look to the Shire, because the small and the humble slipped beneath his notice, because evil, for all its cunning and intelligence, cannot imagine the possibility of its own blind spots, cannot conceive that it might be wrong about something so fundamental as what constitutes a threat. And so the ring remained hidden. The years passed quietly. Frodo grew up, unaware of the burden that would one day be placed upon his shoulders. The Shire turned through its seasons, spring blossoms clothing the hills in white and pink, summer harvests filling the barns, autumn festivals celebrating the bounty, winter snows covering everything in peaceful silence. The world spun on, ignorant and peaceful, while doom slept in a drawer. until the day Gandalf returned to Bag End, no longer the cheerful wanderer who brought fireworks and told stories. He came gray and grim, his face lined with worry, and he spoke the words that would change everything, words that would end the long peace and begin the journey into shadow. This is the One Ring, forged by the Dark Lord Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom. And in that moment, the Shire's long peace ended, not with an army, not with fire and blood, but with a truth too terrible to ignore, a revelation that shattered the comfortable ignorance of centuries. On a distant road, beneath a sky growing dark though the sun has not yet set, a silhouette appears. Tall, cloaked in black that seems to drink in the light around it. Mounted on a horse that makes no sound, whose hooves fall silent on the packed earth. It does not move quickly. It does not need to. It is patient. It is relentless. It has all the time in the world, and it is coming. They came in the autumn of 3018, 9 riders clad in black robes and cloaks, moving through the twilight like pieces of the night itself given form and malice. The Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the 9. Servants of Sauron, bound to him utterly by the rings they bore, their wills extinguished long ago in exchange for power and unending life. They were once kings of men, proud and mighty, ruling kingdoms whose names are now forgotten. But the 9 rings they accepted from Sauron had consumed them over the long ages, hollowed them out, leaving only hunger and obedience and an endless, aching emptiness where their souls once resided. Now they hunted. Their orders were simple, delivered in the throne room of Barad-dûr with the eye burning above them. Find the Shire, find the halfling called Baggins, retrieve the ring by any means necessary. Sauron, at last, had pieced together enough fragments of rumor and interrogation, enough whispered confessions torn from Gollum's throat, to realize that his treasure lay in the hands of a creature he had dismissed as irrelevant. The error infuriated him. The solution was clear. Send the 9. Let them scour the land. Let them bring back what was his. But even now, even with the full weight of Mordor's wrath bearing down upon the Shire, even with the Dark Lord's greatest servants unleashed upon the quest, the invasion did not come as it should have. The conquest did not unfold as one might expect. The Nazgul were powerful, yes. Terrifying beyond measure, yes. Their very presence spread fear like a plague, draining courage from the hearts of those who encountered them. But they were not invincible. They had weaknesses, limitations that Sauron could not eliminate despite his power. They could not endure the light of the sun, not fully, not without pain and diminishment. They were strongest in shadow, in darkness, in fear, in the quiet hours when courage falters and hope seems distant. And they were not warriors in the traditional sense, not generals who led armies into battle. They did not lay siege to cities or command legions in the field. They were hunters, assassins, instruments of terror. Their strength lay in breaking the will of their prey, in making resistance seem futile, not in open battle against prepared enemies. Moreover, they did not know exactly where to go. Shire was a name, a region mentioned in interrogations and old records, but it was not a fortress with gates and guards. It was not a city with walls where the target could be easily located. It was a patchwork of villages, farms, and fields, scattered across rolling hills with no central authority, no registry of inhabitants, no capital where power was concentrated. How does one find a single hobbit, a creature that looks much like every other hobbit to eyes that do not know them, among thousands, in a land with no maps worth the name, no records, no cooperation from the inhabitants? The Nazgul began their search in Bree, that crossroads town where hobbits and men mingled, questioning the innkeeper with voices that made his blood run cold, spreading fear through the streets. They moved through the countryside, following whispers and guesses and the terror they left in their wake. They came to the Shire's borders, slipping through in the growing dark, their presence a cold dread that seeped into the hearts of those who felt it, a wrongness that made dogs howl and children cry. Hobbits, simple and unaccustomed to evil of this magnitude, reacted in different ways. Some hid, barricading themselves in their holes, refusing to answer knocks at their doors. Some fled, gathering children and precious belongings and running to relatives in other parts of the Shire. Some, like Farmer Maggot of the Marish, stood their ground, gripping pitchforks and lanterns, refusing to be cowed by shadows and whispers. Maggot, in fact, met one of the Nazgul face to face, or as close as one can come to facing a wraith, and sent it away with defiance and a pack of very loud, very brave dogs. It is one of the small, absurd miracles of the tale. A farmer, armed with nothing but courage and loyalty and 3 excellent hounds, turning back a servant of the Dark Lord from his own doorstep. But the Nazgul were persistent, patient. They circled like wolves around a flock. They searched, questioned, threatened. They closed in, their net tightening around Hobbiton and Bag End, and they were just barely too late. Frodo, urged by Gandalf's dire warning, had already fled Bag End with his companions. He and Sam, Merry, and Pippin were on the road, moving east toward Rivendell, the ring hidden but growing heavier with every step. The Nazgul pursued them through the Shire, their hunt becoming more focused as they picked up the trail. They followed into the old forest, that wild and dangerous place where trees remembered older days. They tracked the hobbits across the Barrow Downs, where ancient evils still lingered. They came to Bree, missing their quarry by hours. And on Weathertop, that lonely hilltop where once a great watchtower of Arnor stood, they nearly succeeded. There in the darkness, they surrounded the hobbits. There, the Lord of the Nazgul struck Frodo with a Morgul blade, a weapon cursed and deadly, designed to turn its victim into a wraith. The wound was terrible, the pain beyond enduring. Frodo very nearly fell then, very nearly became one of them, a shadow bound to the Dark Lord forever. But he did not. Aragorn was there, fighting with torch and blade. The hobbits showed courage that surprised even themselves, Sam and Merry and Pippin striking at the wraiths with their small swords. And Frodo, in desperation, called upon Elbereth, the name of Varda the Star Queen, and that name had power that the Nazgul could not withstand. They did not succeed. The hobbits evaded them, aided by luck, by the skill of Aragorn who knew every path and hiding place, by the grace of forces unseen. Elrond sent Glorfindel, an elf lord of great power, to meet them on the road. And when the Nazgul finally caught up at the ford of Bruinen, when they charged across the river in their fury, the waters rose up against them in a great wave, sweeping them away in a flood commanded by Elrond. And by the time the Nazgul regrouped, by the time they crawled from the river and returned to their master to report their failure, it was too late for a full invasion of the Shire. The chase had moved on. The ring-bearer was beyond their immediate reach, sheltered in Rivendell where they dared not go. The hunt had shifted. Sauron's attention turned elsewhere, to the breaking of the Fellowship and the movements of armies. The Shire once again was spared, but the near miss was chilling, terrifying in its closeness. The Nazgul had been there. They had ridden through the lanes of the Shire, passed by the very homes where hobbit children slept in their beds. They had knocked on doors and questioned travelers. They had come within hours, perhaps minutes of achieving their goal, of finding the ring and ending the quest before it truly began. If Frodo had delayed even a single day longer at Bag End, lingering to settle his affairs or say goodbye to more friends, the story would have ended differently. If Gandalf's warning had arrived a week later, caught in some delay, the Nazgul would have found their prize. The margins were that thin. The difference between salvation and doom was measured in hours and footsteps. The fact that it did not happen is, in some sense, a miracle. A confluence of small choices, small delays, small acts of courage that together created a margin just wide enough for hope to slip through. And in the aftermath, as the hobbits fled east and the Nazgul gave chase across the wilderness, the Shire was left behind. Shaken, perhaps. A little darker in its collective memory, a little less certain of its absolute safety, but still standing, still green, still home. On the night they came closest, the night the Black Riders swept through Buckland with their terrible searching, the hobbits arrived at Crickhollow just hours too late to be found. The house stood empty when the Nazgul came. The ring-bearer had fled. And in the distance, on a hilltop to the east, a ranger watched through the darkness. His hand rested on his sword, ready to draw if needed. He did not intervene, not yet. The hobbits had to make this journey themselves, had to find their own courage. But he was there, guarding from the shadows. Always he was there. By the winter of 3018, as snow began to fall on the mountains and the great rivers of Middle-earth ran cold, Sauron's focus had shifted entirely. The hunt for the ring was no longer a quiet search conducted in shadow and secrecy. It had become open war. Gondor stood on the brink of assault, its outer defenses already crumbling under pressure from Mordor's forces. Rohan was besieged by treachery from within, its king diminished by the whispers of Grima Wormtongue and the subtle sorcery of Saruman. And Isengard, that fortress in the ring of mountains, had turned traitor. Saruman the White, who should have been the leader of the wise, had fallen into ambition and was breeding an army of Uruk-hai to strike at Rohan. The forces of darkness were arrayed across the map of Middle-earth like pieces on a vast game board, each one positioned for maximum devastation, each move calculated to bring about the final victory. And in the midst of all this, Sauron had no armies to spare for the Shire. This is a crucial point, often overlooked by those who ask why the Shire was not invaded. Even if Sauron had wanted to conquer the Shire, even if he had recognized it as strategically important, even if he had understood that the ring-bearer came from there, he could not have done so, not without compromising his larger strategy. His military resources, vast as they were stretched thin across multiple fronts. Every orc, every troll, every regiment of corrupted men from the east and south was committed to the great offensive. The siege of Minas Tirith required overwhelming force, tens of thousands of soldiers to breach those mighty walls. The assault on Rohan demanded coordination and strength. The defense of Mordor itself, should the Free Peoples somehow manage to mount a counterattack, necessitated garrisons and watchfulness. To divert even a fraction of those forces northward, to send an army marching across hundreds of miles of wilderness to attack a region with no strategic value whatsoever, would have been madness. What would Sauron gain by conquering the Shire? The Shire had no fortresses to capture that could be turned to his advantage, no resources to plunder that would strengthen his position, no armies to eliminate that threatened his borders. It was, from a purely military perspective, worthless, a waste of resources. And by the time Sauron realized that the ring had been in the Shire, by the time he understood the connection, it was already gone. The ring bearer had fled. The trail led east, then south toward Mordor itself. The Nazgul pursued. And the window for an invasion, if it had ever truly existed, closed. Sauron's calculus was simple and brutal, the cold logic of a military mind that had waged war for thousands of years. Crush the major powers first. Destroy Gondor, the ancient enemy that had opposed him for age after age. Shatter Rohan and its cavalry before they can come to Gondor's aid. Seize or destroy the strongholds of the elves if possible. Drive them from Middle-earth or force them into irrelevance. Secure dominion over the strategic centers, the places of power and population. Once that was accomplished, once victory in the great battles was assured, the Shire, and every other minor region, every backwater and borderland could be dealt with at leisure. Mopping up. Consolidation. The slow, methodical extinguishing of every last flicker of resistance, taking as long as necessary because there would be no one left to oppose him. But that plan required victory in the great battles. It required that Minas Tirith fall, that the armies of the West be destroyed on the Pelennor fields, that Rohan be broken at Helm's Deep. It required that the ring return to Sauron's hand, willingly or not, before anyone could threaten Mount Doom. It required that the small and overlooked remain irrelevant, mere footnotes to the great sweep of conquest. And that, of course, is precisely what did not happen. While Sauron poured his strength into the siege of Gondor, while his eye turned toward the Black Gate where he expected the final confrontation, while he calculated the movements of kings and armies, 2 hobbits, unseen, unnoticed, dismissed as beneath concern, crept through Mordor itself. They walked through the very heart of his power, small and quiet and determined. They climbed the slopes of Mount Doom, that terrible mountain where the ring was forged. They stood at the edge of the cracks of doom, where the fires still burn as they did in the beginning, and they destroyed him. Sauron's failure to invade the Shire was not a matter of mercy or restraint or some hidden compassion. It was a matter of priorities, of strategy, of a mind so fixed on the great powers that it could not conceive of a threat from the small. He deployed his forces where logic dictated, where military doctrine suggested. He attacked where victory seemed assured, where the greatest gains could be made. He calculated, planned, maneuvered, all with perfect rationality, with the accumulated wisdom of ages of warfare. And in doing so, in being so perfectly logical and strategic, he left the one path open that could undo him. In the Tower of Barad-dûr, in the room where war is planned and the fate of nations decided, a map burns in the flames of a brazier. It shows Gondor with its 7 levels and white walls, Rohan with its cavalry and its fortified positions, Rivendell hidden in its valley, Lothlorien with its golden trees, all the realms Sauron intends to conquer, all the powers he means to break. The map is detailed, meticulously drawn by skilled cartographers, a work of strategic genius that accounts for every major force in Middle-earth. But the Shire is not on it. The Northwest is blank, an empty space in the corner where mapmakers write, "Here there be nothing of consequence." A region too insignificant to bother marking, too irrelevant to waste ink upon. And in that blank space, in that overlooked corner, the seed of Sauron's doom takes root and grows. There is a theme that runs through all of Tolkien's work like a golden thread, woven into every tale, every song, every rise and fall of kingdoms across the ages. the doom of arrogance. It is the pattern that binds Morgoth's rebellion against the valor to Sauron's defeat, that links Númenor's fall beneath the waves to the folly of Saruman. Pride, unchecked and absolute, swollen beyond all measure, is the great destroyer, the sin from which all other sins flow. Sauron, for all his power and intelligence, for all his accumulated knowledge across thousands of years, falls prey to this most ancient of errors. He cannot imagine that the small might overcome the great. He cannot conceive that humility, rather than ambition, might be the key to victory. He cannot believe that those who seek no power might be the ones to wield the greatest influence over the world's fate. He looks at the world through the lens of domination. Who is strong? Who is weak? Who can be conquered? Who must be destroyed? Who must be brought to heel? And in doing so, he blinds himself to possibilities that lie outside that framework. This is not a flaw unique to Sauron. It is the flaw of every tyrant who has ever lived, every empire built on force and fear and the subjugation of others. They see only what they expect to see. They measure the world by their own values: power, control, supremacy, the ability to command and compel, and dismiss anything that does not fit that measure. The humble, the meek, the quiet acts of courage performed by those without titles or armies or thrones, these are invisible to them. Not because they are hidden, but because the tyrant's mind cannot process them as significant. And so they fall. Not because they are weak, they are not weak. Not because they lack intelligence, they are often brilliant. But because they are blind to their own blindness, unable to see the holes in their vision. Tolkien understood this deeply, with the understanding that comes from lived experience. He had seen it in his own life, in the wars he fought in the trenches of World War I, where generals sent thousands to die for yards of muddy ground. He had watched empires rise and crumble in his lifetime, the British Empire beginning its long decline, the Soviet Union rising on promises of equality and delivering tyranny, Nazi Germany nearly conquering Europe before its own arrogance led to overreach and ruin. He knew that evil, for all its might and terror, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Not because good is inherently stronger in raw power, but because evil cannot help but underestimate what it does not value. The Shire represents everything Sauron despises and dismisses. It is small where he values size, peaceful where he values conquest, content where he values ambition. It values growing things over destroying them, building over conquering, preserving over acquiring. It has no monuments to power, no great works designed to inspire awe and submission. It has no ambitions of empire, no designs on its neighbors' lands. It simply exists quietly, contentedly, in a way that is utterly incomprehensible to a mind like Sauron's. And yet, it is from the Shire that his doom emerges. Frodo and Sam, two hobbits who never wanted glory, who never sought power or dominion, who carried a burden they did not choose and would have given anything to set down, walk into the heart of Mordor and accomplish what armies could not. They do not do it through strength of arms. They are no warriors. They do not do it through magical power. They have none. They do it through endurance, through the simple ability to keep putting one foot in front of the other when every step is agony. Through loyalty, through the bond between friends that cannot be broken, through the stubborn, ridiculous refusal to give up, even when all hope seems lost, even when the task seems impossible. This is the great reversal at the heart of the Lord of the Rings, the fundamental upset of expectations. The mighty Gandalf, Aragorn, the elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien play their parts, yes. They fight the battles that must be fought, hold the lines that must be held, buy the time that must be bought. But the final victory, the act that actually defeats Sauron, belongs to the smallest, the least likely, the ones who were never supposed to matter in the grand scheme of things. And Sauron, until the very end, until the final moment when it is too late to do anything about it, does not see it coming. Even as Frodo stands at the cracks of doom with the ring on its chain, even as he raises it over the fire, Sauron's attention is fixed on the Black Gate, where Aragorn and the pitiful remnant of the Free Peoples have come to challenge him. He sees this as a distraction at best, a futile gesture at worst, a few thousand men standing before his fortress, demanding his attention. He does not realize it is a diversion, a last desperate gamble to draw the eye away from the real threat. That the real danger is not the army at his gates, visible and defiant, but the two small figures inside his own land, climbing toward his destruction step by agonizing step. And when he finally realizes, when Frodo claims the ring for his own at the very brink, when Gollum bites off his finger and falls with the ring into the fire, when the connection between Sauron and his creation is severed and his power begins to unravel, it is too late. Too late to send armies. Too late to dispatch the Nazgul. Too late to do anything but rage and crumble and fall. The Dark Lord, who commanded legions beyond counting, who bent nations to his will with a word, who forged the one ring to dominate all life in Middle-earth, is undone by two hobbits from a land he never bothered to conquer, never deigned to notice, never considered worth his attention. It is, in the truest and most complete sense, the doom of arrogance. The eye, vast and burning, wreathed in flame and malice, sweeps across the battlefield before the Black Gate. It sees Aragorn, the heir of Isildur who dared to reveal himself at last. It sees the armies of men, pitifully small compared to the forces of Mordor, standing defiant before the gates of doom. It sees what it expects to see, a final, desperate challenge from those who refuse to accept the inevitable. But it does not see the two small feet, blistered and bleeding hobbit feet that were never meant for such journeys, taking the last steps up the mountain of fire. It does not see until the moment of claiming, until Frodo stands at the edge and the ring's power surges. And then it sees. Then it understands. And then, in a rush of fire and ruin and rage beyond imagining, the Dark Tower falls. The Shire, when the war finally ended, when the darkness lifted and news of victory slowly spread across Middle-earth, remained much as it had always been. The great battles were fought elsewhere, on the fields of the Pelennor where the Rohirrim charged and the Mumakil fell, at the Black Gate where men stood against hopeless odds, in the halls of Isengard where the Ents brought down Saruman's power. The Shire saw no armies, no sieges, no banners raised in victory or defeat. Life continued in its gentle rhythms. Seasons turned as they always had. Seeds were planted in the spring and harvested in the autumn. To the hobbits who stayed behind, who never left the borders of the Shire, the War of the Ring was a distant thing, felt only in rumors that drifted in from Bree and in the vague unease that troubled their dreams. They did not know, most of them, how close they had come to annihilation. They did not realize that their safety was a miracle, woven from the vigilance of the Rangers and the sacrifice of heroes and the strange movements of fate that no one could have predicted. But a few knew. The travelers, Frodo, Sam, Merry, Pippin, returned to the Shire changed, marked by what they had seen and done. They had walked in the wider world beyond the borders. They had faced darkness in forms the Shire could not imagine. They had stood in places where the old songs were not just stories told by the fire, but lived realities, where the legends walked and spoke and bled. And they carried that knowledge with them, a burden and a gift, something that set them apart from their neighbors who had never left home. The Shire was saved, not by walls of stone or armies of soldiers, not by its own strength or cleverness, but by the quiet convergence of many forces. The rangers who stood watch in the darkness, the grace that lingered in the land from older and better days, the arrogance of the enemy who could not see what was before his eyes, and the courage of the small who refused to despair even when despair seemed the only rational response. In the years that followed, the Shire slowly learned pieces of the truth. Songs were sung of the ring-bearers who had saved the world. Tales were told of the great deeds done in distant lands, of the battles fought and the sacrifices made. The hobbits began to understand, dimly, that they had been part of something larger, something that would echo through the ages, that would be remembered when their grandchildren's grandchildren were old. But even so, even with that growing understanding, life in the Shire did not change much. The gardens still grew, perhaps more beautifully than before thanks to the gift of Galadriel's earth that Sam scattered across the land. The inns still served ale, and the conversations still turned to crops and weather and the latest gossip. Children still played beneath the party tree, laughing and chasing fireflies in the summer dusk, their voices bright and unburdened by the knowledge of what almost was. The Shire remained what it had always been, a place of peace, of simplicity, of quiet joy found in small things well done. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Not that the Shire survived by becoming something else, fortified, militarized, hardened against future threats, but that it survived by remaining itself. That the darkness came close, closer than most would ever know or could imagine, and yet did not extinguish the light. That the goodness and innocence and simple contentment could endure in a world that had seen such evil. Because in the end, the Shire was never truly defenseless. Its defense was not measured in swords or stone, not counted in soldiers or walls. It was measured in the resilience of those who lived there, in their ability to remain good even when goodness seemed foolish, in the watchfulness of those who loved it from the shadows, who gave their lives in nameless battles so that hobbits could sleep safely, and in the grace of a world that still held room for goodness, however small, however overlooked. Sauron never invaded the Shire because he could not see it for what it truly was. He saw weakness where there was strength of a different kind. He saw irrelevance where there was profound significance. He looked at the hobbits and dismissed them as beneath notice, never realizing that they carried within them the one thing he could never possess, the one power he could never comprehend, the ability to choose the good, even when it costs everything. To do what is right simply because it is right, not because it brings power or glory. And so the Shire endured, not through might but through being overlooked, not through power but through humility, not through grandeur and glory, but through the simple, stubborn insistence that a place of peace has value, even in a world of war, perhaps especially in a world of war. The leaves shimmer under golden sunlight, each one a tiny miracle of color and life. The Brandywine River flows, clear and cool and eternal, its waters singing the same song they have sung for ages. Smoke rises from 100 chimneys, curling into a blue sky unmarred by ash or shadow, carrying the scent of bread and bacon and all the homely smells of life continuing. Children laugh beneath the spreading eaves of the party tree, their voices bright and unburdened, playing games that have been played for generations and will be played for generations more. And somewhere far to the east, where the mountains still stand dark against the horizon but no longer threaten, the ruins of Barad Dûr lie silent and broken. The eye is gone, extinguished forever. The shadow has lifted like fog before the sun, but the Shire remains. And in the quiet of the evening, as the first stars kindle above the hills and hobbits settle into their comfortable chairs with pipes and mugs of ale, as the world turns toward night and the day's work is done, a whisper drifts on the wind, soft, almost inaudible, easily missed by those not listening, but true nonetheless. In the small, the great is undone. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.